MMA over the last 3 decades has grown so much, from backyard and underground fighting, which was sanctioned in very few states, to a global phenomenon which is all over the world, and one of the biggest sports in the world. MMA has grown so much due to the sport being so new, and to massive pioneers in and outside the cage, who brought the sport to where it is today. Throughout its history, we have seen fighters become huge global superstars, who have changed their lives forever, becoming household names off the back of a singular performance, where they shocked the world or showed the world their immense talent and skill. We are looking at those fighters today, who had those star-making performances which showcase their talents to the world. This is the Fight Franchise and the top 10 star-making performances in MMA history. Number 10. Holm vs Ronda Rousey. In March of 2011, Ronda Rousey would begin her career in MMA, which went on to take her to superstardom. Holm would also begin her career in MMA after making the transition from boxing. Holm, the opposite of Rousey, would be feared for her striking, as she blitzed through the competition at the start of her career to go 7-0, winning 6 of those fights via stoppage. She would join the UFC and compete in the red-hot women's bantamweight division, due to Rousey being the megastar champion at the top of the division. Holm would win 2 decisions in the UFC to go 9-0, where she would be paired with Ronda Rousey. Rousey was the huge favourite, as she looked unbeatable at the time and was talking about competing in bouts with Floyd Mayweather. Rousey was a phenomenon, finishing everyone she faced in the octagon, which is why at UFC 193, in one of the biggest UFC pay-per-views ever, with one of the biggest crowds ever, Holm put on a masterpiece of striking to shock the world and KO Rousey in the second round with a beautiful head kick. And all the star, hype and fame that Rousey had garnered over her MMA career would be partially absorbed by Holm. Holm became an overnight superstar and known by the world as the woman who beat the unbeatable Ronda Rousey. And though Holm's career never reached the lofty heights of this victory again, she would become a mainstay of the women's MMA over the next few years, competing for titles and main eventing multiple fight nights, a testament to the star she became off this victory. Number 9. Francis Ngannou vs Alistair Overeem. To become a superstar in MMA, you need that it factor. Whether it is winning loads of fights and becoming a dominant champion, an amazing charismatic personality, and even a fun, entertaining fight style. For Francis, his it factor was the scariest knockout power in MMA history. Boxing has shown us over the years that devastating knockout artists can become global superstars and faces of the sport, and in MMA, that is no different. Francis Ngannou burst on the MMA scene, scoring some vicious finishes, and would be signed by the UFC. He would go on a 5-fight win streak in the UFC, winning every fight via stoppage, and would be paired with Alistair Overeem in a title eliminator. Alistair Overeem was a veteran of MMA and kickboxing, and on a 2-fight win streak going into this bout versus Francis. Francis would display his KO power in full effect, KOing Overeem in the first round with a brutal KO which won the KO of the year in many people's eyes, and is viewed by MMA fans as one of the most vicious KOs in MMA history. Once that KO landed, Ngannou was the talk of the town, and was being pushed by the UFC as they saw him as their next big star, and the UFC's equivalent to Mike Tyson. This was a monumental star-making performance, which took Francis to another level. And I know, he lost the next bout to Stipe for the title and then had a boring fight versus Derek Lewis, but he would bounce back and go on a streak to earn the heavyweight title. If you are going to question whether Francis is a star, he most certainly is, shown by the fact he is going to have a mega boxing match against heavyweight champion Tyson Fury later in the year. But his star was catapulted and shown to the world with this vicious KO of Alistair Overeem. Number 8. Israel Adesanya vs Robert Whittaker. One of the biggest superstars in MMA history, the wild, unique and talented Israel Adesanya started his fight career in kickboxing and boxing, eventually working his way into MMA. Israel would join the UFC in February of 2018, making waves as soon as he entered the sport with some of the most unique and technical striking the sport had ever seen. Adesanya would be super active upon entering the UFC, where he had 5 fights in the span of 1 year. He would go on a streak of 4 wins which earned him a bout against his hero Anderson Silva, where Izzy beat Silva by decision in one of the most legendary MMA fights in UFC history, which some people may see as his star-making performance. But he followed this up with one of the best fights in middleweight history, going to war with Kelvin Gastelum for interim gold over 5 rounds, winning a decision, and showed the world he had everything to be a superstar and the future of MMA. But it was the title bout for the undisputed gold against Robert Whittaker where Izzy became a superstar. Adesanya faced Robert Whittaker for undisputed gold in Melbourne, Australia, in the highest attended UFC pay-per-view in MMA history. Adesanya danced into the octagon, showing off his flashy and unique personality and skills, where he danced around and pieced up Whittaker in the octagon and KO'd him in the second round. And in that moment, Adesanya would become a global superstar. He has now become one of the most beloved and unique superstars in MMA history, with his quirky style and remarks on the mic. His influence is now even getting through and becoming a part of real life culture and influencing others, with his amazing 3-arrow celebration and his victory versus Alex Pereira. But Adesanya's superstar was made and truly began with this brilliant performance. Number 7. Jorge Masvidal vs Ben Askren. Some guys become superstars very quickly in MMA and see success in huge levels of fame early on. For others it can take years, if not decades, to see huge success and fame, which was definitely the case for Jorge Masvidal. Masvidal would be fighting in backyards in Miami, where he made the smart decision to actually turn his backyard fighting success into a career and go into MMA in 2003. Masvidal would fight all across the world, seeing mixed success, but eventually landed in Strikeforce, where he worked his way to a title fight versus Gilbert Melendez for lightweight gold, where he would unfortunately lose. Strikeforce would be acquired by the UFC and would bring over their talent, which included Masvidal, who would at the time compete at lightweight with mixed success. He eventually moved up in weight to welterweight and again had mixed success, working himself to a title eliminator but lost to Damian Maia and would lose his following bout to Wonderboy. Masvidal would take over a year-long break from the sport, where he would return and fight the hyped and popular welterweight at the time, Darren Till, in London, England, where Masvidal would KO Till and after the fight had a bust-up with future champ Leon Edwards, where Masvidal became an overnight sensation. He would face in his next fight Ben Askren, who had loads of hype being undefeated and who had just beaten Robbie Lawler. Askren talked so much trash before the fight, which made this fight must watch. Masvidal would sprint across the octagon and threw a flying knee and KO'd Askren in 5 seconds in one of the greatest KOs in MMA history, and in 5 seconds a superstar was made. Masvidal's KO was all over social media and a viral sensation where Masvidal's star blew up. He would face the ultra popular Nate Diaz in his next fight and even headlined on Fight Island against Kamaru Usman in a pay-per-view which did 1.5 million pay-per-view buys. Masvidal off this fight and flying knee became a superstar known by so many, who changed his family and fortune forever, and for this to happen 16 years into a lengthy career makes it that much more impressive. Number 6. Sean O'Malley vs Aljamain Sterling. Sean O'Malley has seemed destined for superstardom ever since his debut on the Contender Series, where Snoop Dogg hyped him to be a future champion. With a creative and unique striking style straight from the go, he was being compared and touted as the next Conor McGregor. And once he got into the UFC following his win on the Contender Series, his style would grow fight after fight, due to his amazing performances in the cage, securing some brilliant wins and stoppages. But what helped Sean so much, he was a product of the time. With a colourful hairstyle and face tattoos, he looked like the next generation of superstars and rappers, and with a growing fan base and social media presence on YouTube with his podcast and gaming, and also his wacky Instagram presence, Sean was amassing loads of fans. But there was doubt around his career, as though he went and earned amazing wins and KOs, he would lose to Tito Vera via TKO. Sean eventually got his career to 15 wins, 1 loss and 1 no contest, but there was huge skepticism around him and his talent and his career, as he had yet to face the best competition at bantamweight, as the 2 best guys he had faced, Chito and Pedro Munoz, would be a loss and a no contest due to an eye poke, which is why it was crazy, with hardly being battle tested in the octagon, he opted to take on former champ and at the time one of the scariest bantamweights ever, Petr Yan. O'Malley won a close and controversial split decision, where he would be in line for a title shot versus Aljamain Sterling. Many thought Sean was given a fast track and an easy route to the title, and didn't have to go through all the contenders at bantamweight, and with no real wins on his resume, and with the Yan fight being disputed by many that he lost, not many fans had hope for him going against Aljo, giving him a puncher's chance, which is all Sean needed, securing the amazing second round stoppage to become UFC champion. O'Malley was a star before this, but the second he beat Aljo, he became a global superstar and his name has grown even more. To see him go from Contender Series to world champion has been surreal, and this superstar could get even bigger. This is one of the most recent star-making performances, but is easily one of the biggest and best. Number 5. Ronda Rousey vs Liz Carmouche. The biggest superstar in women's MMA history, caused some massive waves in the sport and changed the sport forever. Before Ronda Rousey got started in MMA, there was not really women competing in MMA at a high level, only competing on the regional scene. But slowly, women's MMA would start being broadcast on television and would begin to be shown to the MMA masses. It would be legendary promotion Strikeforce which would begin to push women's MMA and would build the 135 and 145 pound division. Chris Cyborg would be the dominant champ at 145 pounds, but it was the 135 pound division which would be pushed by brilliant women who were pioneers of women's MMA. Ronda Rousey would build a name, winning bronze in the Olympics in judo, and would make the move into MMA in 2011. She would end up in Strikeforce, which was a hotbed for women's MMA, and become champion and beat pioneer of women's MMA Miesha Tate in a heated bout and rivalry. Rousey would defend her Strikeforce title and the UFC would acquire Strikeforce, and even brought along their women's divisions and created history, with Ronda Rousey defending the women's bantamweight title in the first ever women's fight in the UFC at UFC 157 in the main event. Rousey would have a scrappy back and forth with Liz Carmouche, which Rousey would secure the armbar in the first round, and in that moment, Rousey would become an overnight star. Women's MMA was in the biggest MMA promotion in the world, and Rousey was the face of it. Ronda would keep winning where her star kept growing, and eventually landing gigs in huge blockbuster movies. It all eventually came crashing to a halt at the hands, or should I say the legs, of Holm. But she has successfully transitioned to WWE and is one of the most recognized faces in MMA history. It was all built and catapulted by her star-making victory against Liz Carmouche in the first ever women's fight in UFC history. Number 4. Chuck Liddell vs Tito Ortiz. One of the biggest superstars in the days while the sport was beginning to become mainstream, Chuck Liddell is one of the main reasons we have the sport we love today. Chuck Liddell began competing in MMA in 1998 and would make his way into the UFC, where he was beginning to build a name for himself in the sport. He would go on a brilliant run in the UFC until he faced Randy Couture, being finished by Randy for the interim light heavyweight title. During the time Liddell was on the come up, the division was being owned by former training partner Tito Ortiz, who was becoming the face of the UFC with his bright blonde hair and brash personality. Liddell, following his loss to Randy Couture, would compete in Pride and beat Alistair Overeem, but get stopped by Rampage Jackson. During this time, Tito Ortiz lost his light heavyweight title to Randy Couture, which meant both guys were coming off a loss and would compete against each other at UFC 47. The former champ Tito Ortiz was one of the biggest names in the sport at the time, taking on Chuck Liddell, whose star was just waiting to blow up. Liddell would KO Ortiz in the second round, and following this, Chuck Liddell became a global star. He would KO Vernon White and then KO Randy Couture to win light heavyweight gold, and went on a KO streak defending his title all the way till he met Rampage Jackson. During this time, Liddell became a star. With his signature mohawk and look, the Iceman would begin to cameo in TVs and movies, and begin to become the face of so many brands in the 2000s. Chuck Liddell personified that era and became a household name, and it would all begin and be launched by this star-making performance. Number 3. Nate Diaz vs Conor McGregor. Nate Diaz would begin in MMA in 2004, following in the footsteps of his brother Nick Diaz. Nate would have a few fights in his early career, going 5-2, but would be scouted for The Ultimate Fighter Season 5, which Nate competed in, where he got some real big exposure at the time and would be known by fight fans as he would win the season and showed off his brash, no-nonsense personality. Following this, Diaz would go on a 5-fight win streak with some brilliant wins, but lose to Clay Guida. He would have an up-and-down career during this time, winning and losing some fights, but went on a streak to earn a lightweight title shot versus Benson Henderson, losing a decision. Following the Benson Henderson bout, Diaz had more bouts with mixed success during this time, but during this time, an Irishman would join the UFC and take it by storm, going on an epic streak, securing the featherweight title, and would look to create history in the UFC by becoming the first simultaneous two-weight world champion. Conor McGregor was supposed to fight RDA for lightweight gold, but Dos Anjos pulled out due to an injury, which is where Nate Diaz stepped in on short notice to fight Conor at 170 pounds. Diaz already called out Conor after his win versus Michael Johnson, and both men faced off at UFC 196. Conor McGregor was on such a hot streak that no one could fathom him losing, which is why when Diaz secured the rear naked choke in the second round, he became a global superstar. Diaz just gave the biggest star in UFC his first loss in the promotion, and stole some of that fame and popularity Conor had garnered. Diaz would become a superstar and has kept his popularity since beating Conor, due to his no-nonsense personality and fun fight style. He even created the BMF title, facing the previously mentioned Jorge Masvidal, just to show how much of a superstar he has become. Nate Diaz is one of MMA's biggest stars ever, but it never happens without this legendary and iconic star-making performance. Number 2. Khabib Nurmagomedov vs Conor McGregor. Beating Conor McGregor may just be the way to become a global superstar. While Conor McGregor was making waves in MMA and becoming a double champion, an undefeated Russian wrestler was destroying the lightweight division and was becoming a huge contender for the title. At UFC 205, Khabib would maul Michael Johnson, and Conor would piece up Eddie Alvarez to become double champ. Khabib, after beating Johnson, called out McGregor, who seemingly stole his shot for the title. McGregor would take a hiatus from the sport to face Floyd Mayweather, while after a lengthy absence, Khabib would return and beat Edson Barboza and then beat Al Iaquinta for vacant lightweight gold. During the build-up of his fight versus Al Iaquinta, Khabib would slap teammate of Conor McGregor, Artem Lobov, where Conor flew across the world to attack Khabib, which began a heated rivalry which culminated at UFC 229. Conor McGregor faced Khabib in the biggest UFC and MMA pay-per-view in history, where Khabib smashed Conor and submitted him in the 4th round. Khabib, after beating Conor, was known to the world, but it's what happened after which turned him into a megastar. Khabib would jump the cage and attack Conor's team, which made headlines all around the the world, where Khabib was the talk of the sports world and became a global superstar. Khabib has become one of the most famous fighters in the world, with a huge fan base in both the East and the West, which is why he earns a higher spot than Diaz. For having that huge global appeal and with that massive fan base and huge social media following he has now garnered, it was no wonder Dana was doing everything to get Khabib to stay. The guy had become a superstar all around the world, which the UFC was about to lose. Nonetheless, this was one of the biggest star-making performances in MMA history. Number 1. Conor McGregor vs Jose Aldo. He is the biggest superstar in MMA history and arguably the biggest in combat sports history. Of course he was going to be number 1. The hard part was deciding which performance. Though the Chad Mendes win was brilliant and a huge moment, seeing him overcome adversity and lift interim featherweight gold, and the Eddie Alvarez win, piecing him up in Madison Square Garden, becoming champ, taking his star to new heights, but nothing compares to Conor's monumental victory against Jose Aldo. Conor McGregor at UFC 189 was meant to face Jose Aldo in a massive event, which had so much promotion and even a world tour to hype up the event, but Aldo had to pull out due to an injury, which is where Conor McGregor would beat Mendes for interim gold, which meant more time and anticipation for Conor to face Aldo, which would take place at UFC 194. The fight would be highly anticipated and a huge pay-per-view to see whether the Irishman was all hype and if he could back his words and beat a seemingly unbeatable champion. Conor brought his words to life and beat Aldo in 13 seconds to become undisputed featherweight champion. It was surreal. He won in devastating fashion, and what made it better, he predicted it. If Conor never beats Jose Aldo, he never becomes the superstar he is today, who has become one of the most famous and richest athletes in the world, who has created a global whiskey brand, broke UFC pay-per-views, and even crossed over to boxing and danced with Floyd Mayweather. This is easily number 1. It gave us the greatest and biggest superstar in MMA history, which is why it earns and deserves the number 1 as the greatest star-making performance in MMA history. Did you enjoy the video? Let us know down in the comments below. What do you think is the greatest star-making performance in UFC history? Put that down in the comments below. Leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe for more MMA and fight content coming soon. We hope you enjoyed the video and we'll catch you in the next one.